Ron Medic, $500 million in property, a business empire stretching across Sydney, and a 4-word sentence that brought it all crashing down. I want him done. Ron Medic was the kind of guy who looked untouchable, a Croatian-Australian property developer who, alongside his brother Roy, built a portfolio worth over £65 million. Hotels, commercial properties, developments scattered across Sydney's southwest. Born in Innisfail, Queensland, educated at St. Joseph's College in Hunters Hill, Medic had done everything by the book for decades. Built the empire brick by brick, the kind of wealth that buys silence, buys loyalty, buys whatever you need. But money couldn't buy Ron Medic out of the mess he'd created with Michael McGurk. McGurk was his business partner. Scottish-born, 45 years old, sharp and aggressive in his own right. The two had been tangled up in property deals worth millions, and when those deals started going sideways, the relationship turned toxic. Lawsuits piled up. Legal fees bled both sides dry. Medic told associates that McGurk was ruining his life, and McGurk had something Medic desperately wanted to keep buried. A tape recording that allegedly showed Medic trying to influence government officials. McGurk wasn't just a business headache anymore. He was a threat to everything Medic had built. And Medic decided the only way to make it stop was to make McGurk stop. Permanently. So Medic called in a favor. His close friend, Fortunato Gattalari, a former professional boxer who went by the nickname Lucky, was offered $500,000 to organize the hit. There was an additional $100,000 on the table for intimidating McGurk's widow afterward. Gattalari brought in Senad Kaminik, Haysam Safatli, and Christopher Estefan to execute the plan. Meanwhile, Medic was making his own preparations. He placed McGurk under surveillance. He even booked a lie detector test for himself, apparently, to practice beating one in case he was ever questioned by police. On September 3rd, 2009, a gunman walked up to Michael McGurk outside his home in Cremorne on Sydney's lower North Shore. Quiet neighborhood, tree-lined street, the kind of place where nothing ever happens. One shot to the head. McGurk collapsed on the pavement. His 9-year-old son Luke was standing right there. Watched his father die. The investigation unraveled Medic's world piece by piece. The turning point came when Gattalari, the man who'd organized the whole thing, flipped. He turned Crown witness and told prosecutors everything in exchange for a 60% sentence reduction. The surveillance, the planning, the recorded conversations where Medic made his intentions unmistakable. When asked directly if he was sure about ordering the hit, Medic's response was chilling in its casualness. "I am sure. I want him done." Medic's first trial in 2017 ended with a jury that couldn't reach a verdict. But prosecutors weren't giving up. They came back with the same evidence, the same witnesses, and on April 23, 2018, a second jury in the New South Wales Supreme Court found Ron Medic guilty of murder and guilty of intimidation. Justice Jeffrey Bellew handed down the sentence, 39 years maximum, a non-parole period initially set at 27 years, later adjusted on appeal to 30 years. That means Medic's earliest possible parole date falls on February 26, 2048. He will be 100 years old. Medic appealed, denied in March 2021. The judge noted he showed absolutely zero remorse. Not for McGurk, not for the 9-year-old boy who watched his father die in front of him. Nothing. At 76 years old, Ron Medic will almost certainly die behind bars. A man who had everything. Properties, wealth, influence. And he threw it all away. because he decided a business dispute was worth another man's life. But Medic isn't the only wealthy developer who treated murder like a business transaction. This next case involves a property magnate who killed a tenant over a £2 million deal, then fled the country and reinvented himself as a Palm Beach playboy. Thanos Papalexis. He hosted Bill and Hillary Clinton at a fundraiser. He drove a Bentley through the streets of Palm Beach. He furnished his office with actual thrones. And the entire time, he was running from a murder he'd committed with his own hands in a warehouse in northwest London. Thanos Papalexis was born in London on July 23, 1972, to a Greek family. His father worked in shipping operations, a respectable middle-class career. But Papalexis liked to tell people his family owned the ships. That gap between who he actually was and the story he sold everyone else would follow him for the rest of his life. By his late 20s, Papalexis had muscled his way into London's property development scene. He had projects in the pipeline, money flowing, deals stacking up. But his ambitions outpaced his resources. A residential development in Holloway called the Oasis went catastrophically wrong. The whole project got put into receivership with £8 million in debt hanging over it. Papalexis was bleeding £60,000 every single week in interest payments on a bridging loan. He was drowning, and he needed a lifeline. That lifeline was a warehouse property in Kensal Rise, northwest London. He had a buyer ready. £2 million on the table. The sale would stop the financial hemorrhaging and buy him time to restructure everything else. One problem. A man named Charalambos Christodoulidis was living in a flat inside the warehouse. Charalambos was 55 years old, a Cypriot caretaker everyone called Bambi. Quiet guy, kept to himself, and he wouldn't leave. For most developers, this is an inconvenience you solve through lawyers and eviction courts. For Thanos Papalexis, it became something far worse. In March of 2000, Papalexis lured Bambi to the warehouse on Bannister Road. He had two accomplices waiting, Robert Baxija, 29, and Ili Shalo, 36, both Albanian nationals living illegally in the UK. They tied Bambi to a chair, beat him, tortured him, and then Papalexis strangled him to death. What came next was methodical. They wrapped the body in a blanket, pulled wool hats over his face, doused him in paint stripper to try to destroy evidence, and dumped him in a mechanic's inspection pit beneath the warehouse floor. Then Papalexis disappeared. By 2001, he'd surfaced 3,000 miles away in Palm Beach, Florida. And the reinvention was staggering. A $3 million mansion in the exclusive enclave of Manalapan, Savile Row Suites, the Bentley, an office decorated with actual thrones. He created a new identity as an international real estate visionary, even developing a proprietary 200-year land lease format for Florida properties. He was attending galas, doing business, building a name. In January 2008, he reached the peak of his American fantasy. He hosted a fundraiser party at which Bill and Hillary Clinton were guests. The former president of the United States, shaking hands and making small talk with a man who had tortured and murdered someone in a London warehouse 8 years earlier. But Papalexis had a fatal weakness that his carefully constructed persona couldn't contain. He was a compulsive sex addict. He hosted elaborate parties, filmed himself, and surrounded himself with women. One of those women was a porn star named Rebecca DeFalco. During one of their encounters, Papalexis made the most reckless mistake of his life. He told DeFalco, in graphic detail, how he had killed a man in London. By the time the net closed around him in November 2008, the American dream was already falling apart. He was $2 million in debt, facing multiple lawsuits, the empire collapsing for the second time in his life. Police found him eating at a pizza restaurant called Fire Rock in Palm Beach. He was extradited back to the UK and stood trial at the Old Bailey. The proceedings lasted 14 weeks. On September 4th, 2009, the jury delivered its verdict: guilty of murder. Judge Jeremy Roberts called him a totally amoral person. Detective Inspector Brent Hyatt described him as an enormously arrogant, compulsive, and practiced liar, driven by his desire to make money. The judge told him directly, "You treated Charalambos as completely expendable." Life imprisonment, 20-year minimum. His accomplices were convicted in a separate retrial. Shalo got 17 years minimum. Bakshaija got 15. The victim's sister kept her assessment simple. She called him the devil. But if you think killing a man over a property deal is cold, wait until you hear about the millionaire who bugged his girlfriend's apartment with a hidden listening device. Heard something he didn't like, and reached for a piece of baling twine from his own farm. Peter Morgan. He paid her £10,000 a month just to be exclusive to him. He put her in a house on his castle grounds. He installed a hidden listening device in her home so he could hear every word she said. And when he overheard her talking about leaving and taking his money with her, he walked in and strangled her with farm equipment. Peter Morgan was a multi-millionaire property developer from Llanellan, near Abergavenny in South Wales. At 54, he owned Pencode Castle, multiple farms, and enough property to make him one of the wealthiest men in the region. He was separated from his wife and navigating what was looking like an extremely expensive divorce. That's when he met Georgina Simons. Georgina was 25 years old, a former burlesque dancer, a mother of one, working as an escort when she crossed paths with Morgan. He didn't want a casual arrangement. He wanted total exclusivity. So he offered her between £7,000 and £10,000 per month to stop seeing anyone else, no other clients, no other men. He set her up in a £300,000 bungalow on the grounds of his own Pencode Castle property in Llanmartin, Newport. She was comfortable, financially secure, and living in the shadow of a castle. On the surface, it looked like a wealthy man providing a better life for a young woman. Underneath, it was a cage. Morgan couldn't stand not knowing what Georgina was doing when he wasn't there. So he installed a covert listening device inside her bungalow. It was disguised as a socket adapter, a small plug-in device you'd never look twice at. Through it, Morgan could listen to her phone calls, her conversations with friends, her private moments, every word. And one day, sitting somewhere with his ear pressed to a feed from the woman he was paying to love him, he heard Georgina say she was planning to leave. She was going back to work, and she was going to fleece him financially on the way out. For Peter Morgan, that was a death sentence. Hers. There had been warnings. During a trip to New York, Georgina had reported Morgan to police for rape and attempted strangulation. But those charges never gained traction, and the relationship, despite the violence, continued under the weight of money and dependency. After hearing the recording, Morgan didn't act impulsively. He planned. He made lists of items he'd need. He researched poisoning her with antifreeze. He ran internet searches on methods. He set up alibis to account for his whereabouts. This was not a man who snapped. This was a man who scheduled a murder like a business meeting. On January 12, 2016, Peter Morgan walked into the bungalow on his castle grounds and strangled Georgina Simons with baling twine from his farm. She was 25 years old. He wrapped her body in black plastic sheeting, loaded it into a vehicle, drove to Beach Hill Farm in Usk, and hid her in a workshop behind other materials. The trial at Newport, Crown Court, ran for more than 3 weeks in December 2016. Morgan's defense team tried an unusual strategy. They argued diminished responsibility, claiming Morgan had Asperger's syndrome and couldn't fully process the moral consequences of his actions. Prosecutor Q.C. William Hughes took that argument apart. The internet searches, the lists, the alibi construction, the surveillance device, every single piece of evidence painted the portrait of a methodical, organized killer who understood exactly what he was doing, planned it carefully, and executed it without hesitation. After 17 hours of deliberation, the jury came back unanimous. Guilty of murder, guilty of concealing a body, life imprisonment, 25-year minimum, sentenced the same day. Morgan later appealed for a reduced sentence. The appeal judges refused, describing him as obsessed with Simons. Her mother, Deborah Simons, delivered an impact statement that cut through the courtroom. Georgina has left a hole in our lives that will never be repaired. Whatever sentence is handed to Peter Morgan will never compensate for our loss. Every case so far involves someone who deliberately chose violence. But what happens when a wealthy man kills someone through sheer recklessness? And instead of calling an ambulance, his first thought is catching a flight to Frankfurt? Jonathan Cain. She was wearing a high-visibility fluorescent jacket with a reflective strip. She was walking 2 dogs down a country lane she'd walked 1,000 times before. And he hit her with a Land Rover, got out, checked his bumper, got back in, and drove to the airport. Jonathan Cain was a 52-year-old businessman who ran a family company selling safety equipment to clients around the world. Take a moment with that. Safety equipment. The irony of what comes next is almost unbearable. Cain lived well. A primary residence on Flood Street in Chelsea, London. A second home in Trebetherick, Cornwall. A small stake in a boat manufacturing company called Cornish Crabbers in nearby Rock. Married, 3 children, the kind of comfortable upper-middle-class existence where everything ticks along without much friction. Catherine Bailey, known to everyone as Kate, was 45 years old and had lived in St. Minver, North Cornwall, her entire life. On the evening of July 18, 2016, around 8:30, she was doing what she did most evenings, walking her 2 collie dogs down Trueston Lane to her parents' house to feed the chickens. A quiet errand on a quiet lane on a quiet summer evening. She was wearing a fluorescent jacket with a reflective strip. She was visible. She was careful. Jonathan Cain was driving his Land Rover Defender down the same lane. Prosecutors would later argue that he was distracted by a Great Western Rail app on his phone, tracking a sleeper train he needed to catch for a business trip to Frankfurt. He hit Kate Bailey at approximately 8:30. She went into a ditch by the side of the road. Here is where the story splits from tragedy into something else entirely. Cain stopped. He got out of the Land Rover. He looked at the vehicle, checked the damage, then he got back in and drove away. He later claimed he thought he'd hit an animal and that the car seemed safe to continue driving. The prosecution didn't believe that for a second. Neither did the jury. His priority wasn't the woman in the ditch. It was catching his train. He drove the damaged Land Rover to Bodmin, missed the train, drove to Plymouth, missed it again, kept driving to Exeter, where he finally caught the 1 a.m. sleeper service to London. From Paddington, he took the Heathrow Express to the airport and boarded a flight to Frankfurt for business meetings. While Jonathan Cain sat in a German conference room the next day, Kate Bailey's husband found her body in the ditch. On the lane she walked every evening, Kane learned she was dead from a BBC News article. On his phone, in Germany. He did eventually make arrangements to return to the UK. He booked a train back to Cornwall. Police met him at his London home before he could make the trip. At Truro Crown Court, Kane pleaded guilty to causing death by careless driving and driving without insurance. But he denied the more serious charge of causing death by dangerous driving. He tried to frame it as an accident, a momentary lapse, an honest mistake compounded by panic. The jury heard the evidence, the phone app, the extended flight from the scene, the multiple attempts to catch trains, the international flight while a woman lay dead in a ditch. They came back on November 3rd, 2017, with a guilty verdict on the dangerous driving charge. The sentence hit the community like a slap. 2 years in prison, a 5-year driving ban. People in St. Minver were furious. The local police held an unusual public community meeting during the investigation because tensions were running so high. Social media erupted. 2 years for killing a woman and fleeing the country. For prioritizing a business meeting over a human life. Kane has since served his sentence. He has stated he hasn't driven since the incident and doesn't intend to ever drive again. Kate Bailey's family got 2 years of what the justice system calls accountability. Kate got nothing at all. But if Kane's callousness shocks you, this next case will turn your stomach. Because this millionaire didn't just kill his victim and flee. He strangled her in a hotel room on New Year's Eve, hung a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door, drove her car to the airport, hopped flights through Qatar to Tanzania, and then spent weeks taunting police and the victim's family by phone while they hunted him across continents. Sami Al-Mahri. He told her he was an FBI agent. He flew across the Atlantic to shower her with money and expensive gifts. And on New Year's Eve 2014, in a Cardiff Bay hotel room, he killed her because she refused to be controlled. Sami Al-Mahri was a 44-year-old New York businessman, a millionaire with properties and business interests across the city. In 2013, he created a profile on a Muslim dating website called muslimmatch.com. That's where he found Nadine Abaris. Nadine was 28, a British student living in Cardiff, a mother, smart, warm, full of energy. Her mother, Andrea, would later describe her as a ray of sunshine in everyone's lives and the glue that made this family. The relationship began long distance, and Al-Mahri played the role perfectly. The successful American businessman, the worldly, protective partner. He claimed to work for the FBI, a complete fabrication. He flew across the ocean to see her. Sent expensive gifts, money, grand romantic gestures that painted a picture of a man who was serious, sophisticated, and deeply committed. But behind the gifts and the flights and the sweet talk, something was very wrong. When Nadine visited Al-Mahri in New York in 2014, she reported to police that he had raped her and attempted to strangle her during the trip. Those charges went nowhere. Al-Mahri remained free. And despite the violence, some form of the relationship continued, held together by money and the kind of cycle that keeps so many victims stuck. As months passed, Al-Mahri's jealousy turned into full-blown surveillance. From his apartment in New York, 3,000 miles away, he started tracking Nadine's daily life. Investigators later discovered he had compiled a minute-by-minute account of her movements, logging when she left home, where she went, who she spoke to. When he suspected she was seeing other men, the messages turned threatening. "You will be in hell." He told her he would post intimate photographs of her on Facebook. He sent her a message that read, You will be so sorry. I know you're with someone else." By late December 2014, Al-Mahri had flown to Wales. On December 30th, he and Nadine checked into the Future Inn Hotel in Cardiff Bay. Whatever happened in that room over the next 24 hours ended on the morning of December 31st. New Year's Eve, Al-Mahri strangled Nadine Aburas to death. And then he showed exactly how calculated he was. He hung a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the hotel room door to buy himself time. He took Nadine's car, drove it to Heathrow Airport, and boarded a flight. First to Qatar, then to Tanzania. All while hotel staff respected the sign on the door and a young woman's body cooled in the room behind it. But Al-Mahri didn't just run, he taunted. From abroad, he made phone calls and sent messages to both police and Nadine's family. He wanted them to know he was out, there, free, while they grieved and searched. He enjoyed it. It took an Interpol warrant and international coordination to bring him down. On January 19, 2015, Al-Mahri was arrested in Tanzania. He was extradited back to the United Kingdom to face charges. His first legal strategy was to dodge the murder charge entirely. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter, claiming a psychiatric disorder. He said he heard the voice of God commanding him to kill Nadine. It was a desperate play, and nobody in the courtroom was buying it. On October 20th, 2016, standing in Cardiff Crown Court, Al-Mahri changed his plea to guilty of murder. The sentencing came on November 3rd. Mrs. Justice Nicola Davies imposed life imprisonment with a minimum term of 17 years. She noted that the killing was prompted by jealousy and anger. Detective Chief Inspector Gareth Morgan didn't soften his assessment. He called Al-Mahri's actions callous and brutal and, said he, immediately sought to avoid responsibility by fleeing the country. Nadine's mother, Andrea, delivered an impact statement that silenced the courtroom. She was a ray of sunshine in everyone's lives. By taking Nadine, Al-Mahri has taken the glue that made this family. Sami Al-Mahri sits in a British prison cell today, a man who crossed an ocean to murder a woman who wouldn't be owned, a millionaire who thought his money and his lies made him untouchable. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Robert E. Kaireb. His wife was 27 years old. She was 4 months pregnant, and when she disappeared from their Hampstead flat, he didn't call the police. He called a carpet fitter. Robert E. Kaireb was a property tycoon of Iraqi Jewish descent, 39 years old and living in Hendon, northwest London. He owned more than 50 properties worth a combined £65 million, plus a jewelry business in Hatton Garden, London's Diamond District. On paper, he was the picture of success. In reality, he was a controlling, volatile man whose paranoia consumed everyone close to him. Li Hua Chao, who went by Li Hua, was 27 when she married Kaireb in 2006. She was Chinese-born, had worked as a waitress and as a lap dancer before meeting him. When they married, Kaireb insisted she stop dancing. It wasn't in keeping with his Jewish tradition, he said. She agreed. She moved into his flat on Mount Vernon Rise estate in Hampstead. And then the walls started closing in. Despite sitting on a property empire worth tens of millions, Kaireb restricted his wife's access to money. He was prone to violent mood swings. In August 2006, just months into the marriage, he was arrested for assaulting Cow and possessing a flick knife after an argument in a car. She withdrew the charges. He hired a private detective to follow her. He booked a lie detector test for the month she would ultimately die. The reason for the paranoia was the pregnancy. Chow was 4 months pregnant, and Akireb had convinced himself the baby might not be his. He couldn't shake the thought of her former job, the men she might have known. Meanwhile, Chow was quietly miserable. She spoke to doctors about terminating the pregnancy because of how unhappy she was. She made 4 separate calls to her brother Li Bin, telling him she wanted out. She tried to open a new bank account. She was planning an escape. She never made it. On October 23, 2006, Li Hua Chow was last seen alive at the couple's Hampstead flat. She was just 3 months into her marriage. What happened next was pieced together years later through what prosecutors called brick-by-brick circumstantial evidence. A security officer at the building reported seeing someone carrying a carpet out of the premises late at night. A car left the building shortly after. Akireb never returned to the flat. Instead, he registered it with an estate agent for reletting and hired a firm to refit the carpets and clean the property. He was erasing her. Investigators believe Chow's body was wrapped in the bedroom carpet, placed in the boot of a car, doused in chemicals, and disposed of through connections to organized crime networks. Her body has never been found. Not a trace, not a bone, nothing. The investigation dragged on for 6 years. 6 years of building a case without a body. In June 2012, Robert Akireb was finally arrested and charged with murder. The trial at the Old Bailey lasted 10 weeks. The prosecution had no body, no murder weapon, and no forensic evidence. What they had was a pattern: the controlling behavior, the violence, the surveillance, the lie detector test, the calls from Chow to her brother, the carpet, the cleaning, the complete disappearance of a woman who had no reason to vanish and every reason to stay connected to her family. On December 23, 2013, the jury convicted Robert Akireb of murder. Justice Jeremy Cook handed down the sentence: life imprisonment, 22-year minimum. He called Akireb a callous, manipulative, selfish hypocrite and addressed the full weight of what he'd done. This was the murder of a pregnant wife, a woman pregnant with a viable fetus when you killed her. In that sense, you ended 2 lives. Akireb launched multiple appeals. He claimed his barrister was incompetent. He claimed a newly diagnosed case of Asperger's syndrome affected his trial. Every appeal was denied. The Criminal Case Review Commission refused to send the case back to the Court of Appeal. He sits in a UK prison today. Li Hua Chow's family never got to bury her. Her body is still out there somewhere, dissolved or hidden by a man who owned 50 properties and couldn't give his wife the dignity of a grave. But if you think a murder without a body is disturbing, wait until you hear about the man who called himself an emissary of the devil. He threw a grenade into a rabbi's house, built a 40 million pound palace as his own mausoleum, and when he was convicted of killing a business rival, he found a way to walk free. Nicholas van Hoogstraten. He called himself an emissary of Beelzebub. He paid a gang to throw a grenade into a rabbi's house. He built a 40 million pound palace designed to serve as his own tomb. And when he was convicted of killing a man, he got the conviction overturned and never spent another day in prison. Nicholas van Hoogstraten, born Nicholas Marcel Hoogstraten on February 25, 1945, in Shoreham-by-Sea, Sussex, was Britain's youngest self-made millionaire. By 22, he owned 350 properties. By 35, he had over 2,000. At his peak, his estimated worth was £800 million, built from property, mines, art, farms, shares, and money lending. He was also, by any measure, a violent and dangerous man long before anyone accused him of murder. In 1968, at 23 years old, Van Hoogstraten was sentenced to 4 years in prison for hiring a gang to throw a hand grenade into the home of Rabbi Bernard Braunstein. The same year, he got an additional 4 years, served concurrently, for handling stolen goods. In 1972, he received 15 months for bribing prison officers. That same year, he was fined for forcible entry and conspiracy to damage property. In 1979, he was fined for punching and kicking a bailiff. A judge in 1970 described him as a sort of self-imagined devil who likes to think of himself as an emissary of Beelzebub. Van Hoogstraten didn't deny it. He embraced it. He described himself publicly as probably ruthless and probably violent. He called his tenants filth and ramblers who crossed his land scavengers. By the early 1980s, the tax authorities had sequestered his assets over a £5.3 million unpaid tax bill. But Van Hoogstraten was a survivor. He restructured, rebuilt, and continued accumulating wealth and enemies in equal measure. One of those enemies was Mohammed Sabir Raja, a 62-year-old businessman who claimed Van Hoogstraten had defrauded him of more than £1 million in a property dispute dating back to the 1980s. The feud dragged on for years, escalating through courts and threats. On July 2, 1999, 2 men arrived at Raja's home in Sutton, Surrey. Michael Palmer and Sadiq Islam. They stabbed Raja 5 times and shot him in the head. His grandson was in the house at the time. Palmer and Islam were convicted of murder in 2000 and received life sentences. But investigators weren't done. They believed the men were hired, and they believed the man who hired them was Nicholas Van Hoogstraten. On September 24, 2001, Van Hoogstraten was charged with murder. The trial at the Old Bailey lasted 13 weeks. On July 22, 2002, the jury returned its verdict. Not guilty of murder, but guilty of manslaughter by an 11-1 margin after 8 days of deliberation. He was sentenced in October to 10 years, and then something remarkable happened. In July 2003, the Court of Appeal quashed the manslaughter conviction entirely. The court ruled that the trial judge had failed to mention to the jury that one of the hitmen possessed a sawn-off shotgun and that the prosecution had not sufficiently proved Van Hoogstraten anticipated Raja might actually be killed. By November, a retrial judge ruled there was no foundation for the manslaughter case at all. Nicholas Van Hoogstraten was formally acquitted. Released in December 2003, a free man. The Raja family didn't give up. In December 2005, they won a £6 million civil judgment against him. Van Hoogstraten refused to pay. He claimed he had no significant assets, despite the obvious wealth held in trusts under his children's names. And then there was Hamilton Palace, a massive unfinished mansion in Uckfield, East Sussex, begun in the mid-1980s at a cost of over £40 million. Van Hoogstraten designed it as a mausoleum to house his art collection after death. A monument to himself, built by a man who described himself as the devil's emissary. He remains free today, still operating his property empire through trusts, never paid the civil judgment. The only person on this list who was convicted, imprisoned, and then walked away from it all. But walking free doesn't mean the story always ends well. This next case involves a millionaire who killed his wife, faked a kidnapping, posted bail, and then disappeared for nearly 5 years. He crossed into Mexico on foot. He washed dishes in restaurants. He told strangers his family had died on Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. And the podcast that caught him generated thousands of tips from around the world. Peter Chadwick. He called 911 from San Diego, claiming a handyman named Juan had killed his wife and kidnapped him. There was dried blood on his hands when police found him. He was 4 miles from the Mexican border, and the story fell apart within hours. Peter Chadwick was a British-American real estate millionaire living in Newport Beach, California. 49 years old, father of 3 boys aged 8, 10, and 14. He and his wife Qui Chu Lim Chadwick, who went by QC, had been married for 21 years. They lived in a $2.5 million home. From the outside, it was the California dream. QC was 46. Malaysian-born, Arizona State University graduate, a stay-at-home mother who had given up her career to raise their sons. By 2012, the marriage was crumbling. There were disputes about a possible divorce, and with that, disputes about money. The kind of money that makes people do terrible things. On the morning of October 10th, 2012, Peter Chadwick strangled his wife in their Newport Beach home. Then he built a story. He wrapped QC's body, put it in the car, and drove south, all the way to the San Diego area near the Mexican border. He dumped her body in a dumpster. Then he called 911 with a story about a handyman named Juan who had killed QC's and forced Chadwick at gunpoint to drive south and dispose of the body. Police found him 4 miles from the border. There was dried blood on his hands, scratches on his neck. The handyman's story collapsed almost immediately. He admitted he'd made it up. Back in Newport Beach, the scene told the real story. Blood and signs of a struggle inside the home. The couple's 3 sons had never been picked up from school that day. Another parent, finding the home empty, had called the police. Chadwick was charged with murder. And then, in a decision that still baffles the community, a judge set bail at $1.5 million. Chadwick posted it. He surrendered both passports. He was required to stay with his father in Santa Barbara and make regular court appearances. For 2 years, he complied. Showed up to every hearing, played the part of a man cooperating with the justice system. Then, in January 2015, Peter Chadwick vanished. He'd been preparing quietly. He withdrew between $600,000 and $1 million from bank accounts. He left breadcrumbs suggesting he'd fled to Canada, a false trail. In reality, he crossed the Mexican border on foot, without a passport, and disappeared into a country of 130 million people. For nearly 5 years, Chadwick lived as a ghost. He started in luxury hotels and resorts, burning through his cash. As the money dried up, he downgraded to motels, then hostels. He worked odd jobs, bussing tables, washing dishes, teaching conversational English to children. He used multiple fake identities, including the name Paul Cook. And the cover story he told people in Mexico? He said his family had died aboard Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, the plane that vanished over the Indian Ocean in 2014. He used a real tragedy to explain why he was alone, why he had no connections, why nobody ever came looking for him. He lived in the town of Pátzcuaro for 2 years, then Valle de Bravo, then San Andrés Cholula near Puebla, always moving, always looking over his shoulder. In September 2018, the U.S. Marshals added Chadwick to their 15 most wanted list, with a $100,000 reward. Newport Beach Police produced a podcast called Countdown to Capture that generated thousands of tips from listeners around the world. On August 4th, 2019, Mexican and American authorities tracked him to a residential duplex near Puebla. He'd been traced through a payphone call. Nearly 5 years on the run, and it ended with a knock on the door. He was deported to California the next day. Bail denied. No more chances. On February 10th, 2022, Chadwick pleaded guilty to second-degree murder as part of a plea deal. In court, he cried. He apologized. He said he had destroyed everything. 15 years to life. He must serve a minimum of 85% before he's even eligible for parole. That's roughly 12 years and 9 months at the earliest. Prosecutor Matt Murphy summed up the case without sympathy. Nobody thought he would flee from his sons. He abandoned his family, made his attorney look terrible, and thumbed his nose at the court. QC's family laid bare the damage. Her brother-in-law lost more than 10 pounds in the first 4 weeks, eaten alive by guilt for giving his blessing when Chadwick asked to marry her. Her sister said she cannot begin to comprehend the fear and suffering that Q endured. Peter Chadwick sits in a California state prison today. A man who killed his wife, abandoned his 3 sons, fled across an international border, and spent 5 years pretending his family died in a plane crash. All because he couldn't bear to split the money. But our next case takes us back to Australia and a man they called the King of Manly. Andrew Kalizic. The hitman tried 6 times. The gun jammed on the first attempt. He came back 5 more times before he finally got the shot, and the husband was lying right there in the bed when it happened. His plan? Roll off the mattress. Andrew Kalizic was born in 1941 to Yugoslav immigrants who had arrived in Australia just 2 years earlier. He grew up in Sydney, and by 25, he and his brother had built a successful fish business in Manly, the beachside suburb on Sydney's northern beaches. From fish, Kalizic moved to real estate, then hospitality. In 1983, he opened the Manly Pacific International Hotel. He became president of the Manly Chamber of Commerce. People called him the King of Manly. A millionaire, a community leader, a man who'd turned immigrant roots into a small empire. He married Megan Carmichael in 1962. They had 2 children, Michelle in 64 and Andrew in 66. By all outward appearances, it was a solid family. Behind closed doors, it was something else entirely. There was domestic violence, there were assaults, and by the mid-1980s, after 24 years of marriage, Megan wanted out. A divorce would have cost Kalizic millions. His properties, his hotel, his businesses, everything he'd built over decades would be carved up in court. He decided he'd rather pay a hitman than a divorce lawyer. The hitman was Bill Vandenberg. The agreed price was $20,000. And the plan was, by any standard, insane. Kalizic would be in the bed when Vandenberg came into the house. Megan would be asleep beside him. When Vandenberg fired, Kalizic would roll off the bed to safety. The whole thing would be staged to look like a home invasion gone wrong. Originally, Kalizic wanted Vandenberg to shoot him in the leg for authenticity, but they agreed that was too risky. Vandenberg tried to carry out the hit 6 times before he succeeded. On the first attempt, the gun jammed. He came back again and again, and each time something went wrong. Finally, on January 27, 1986, at approximately 1 in the morning, Vandenberg entered the family's waterfront mansion in Fairlight, Sydney. He fired twice into Megan's head with a rifle as she slept. 2 additional bullets went into Kalizic's pillow as he rolled off the bed to escape. Megan's mother and their son Andrew were both in the house at the time. Megan was killed instantly. She was a dental nurse, a ballroom dancer, a mother of 2. The aftermath was suspicious from the start. Kalajic waited 7 minutes before calling emergency services. The jury would later find this deeply telling. A neighbor reported hearing screams. The crime scene was inconsistent with a random break-in. The investigation built slowly, but it built. Vandenberg, the hitman, eventually turned on Kalajic. He provided details of the arrangement, the payment, the multiple failed attempts, the rolling off the bed plan. Then, 2 days after Kalajic was sentenced, Vandenberg killed himself in prison. The trial at the New South Wales Supreme Court lasted 11 weeks in early 1988. Andrew Kalajic was found guilty of murder, conspiracy to murder, and discharge of a firearm with intent to murder. He was originally sentenced to life. In 1997, under truth in sentencing legislation, that was adjusted to a minimum of 25 years. Kalajic fought his conviction for decades. In 1995, retired Supreme Court Judge John Slattery conducted a full judicial inquiry into the case. His findings were unequivocal. No doubts or questions about the guilt of the petitioner. He added a line that stuck. The very traits which made him a successful businessman were also his undoing. He used people for his own ends, and eventually, that caught up with him. In 1993, Kalajic was savagely beaten at Lithgow Correctional Center. Investigators said he came within a millimeter of life. In 2005, he offered to donate a kidney to the state in exchange for early release. The offer was rejected. He was finally granted parole on January 25, 2012, after serving 25 years and 1 month. He walked out of Silverwater Jail on February 8th at age 71. To this day, Andrew Kalajic maintains his innocence. He says someone broke into the house and he rolled off the bed to escape. His adult children, Michelle and Andrew, believe him. He gave an exclusive interview to the program Sunday Night in 2012, returning to the murder scene for the cameras. But the community, the courts, and the evidence tell a different story. A millionaire who hired a hitman, a gun that jammed 6 times, and a wife who died in her sleep because a divorce would have cost too much. Our final case is the youngest person on this list. He wasn't a self-made millionaire. He was born into a fortune worth £230 million. And on Christmas Eve morning, he walked into his best friend's bedroom with 2 knives and didn't stop stabbing until the screaming stopped. Dylan Thomas. They'd been best friends for a decade. They shared a house. And the night before Christmas Eve, one of them searched the internet for anatomy of neck, veins, and arteries. Dylan Thomas was born on June 30th, 2000, in Jersey. His grandfather was Sir Stanley Thomas, the man who built Peter's Pies into an empire and was knighted in 2006. The family fortune was estimated at £230 million, with some reports putting it as high as £293 million. Dylan moved to Cardiff at age 1 and grew up in privilege. Cathedral School in Llandaff, then Christ College Brecon, a house called Ty Matthew, owned by his grandfather. But the wealth didn't translate into an easy life. Dylan's parents separated when he was 3. There were allegations of domestic violence in the home. He suffered from asthma. He became withdrawn, isolated, a loner by most accounts. His one real connection was William Bush. Will Bush was 23, a surveyor, a keen golfer, quiet, loyal, and universally liked. His family described him as loving, loyal, caring. He and Dylan had met at school and become inseparable, best friends for a decade. They moved in together at Ty Matthew and had been sharing the house for more than 2 years. But the friendship was not what it looked like from the outside. Dylan Thomas was jealous of Will Bush, jealous of his close family relationships, his success, his girlfriend Ella Jeffries, the ease with which Bush moved through the world. Thomas was the one with the money, the family name, the inheritance waiting, but Bush was the one with the life. At some point, the jealousy turned into something darker. Thomas once told Bush that he wondered what it would be like to kill him. Bush's reaction was telling. That night, he barricaded his bedroom door. On the evening of December 23, 2023, Thomas had dinner with family and then stayed overnight with his grandmother, Sharon Burton, in Ruse. Late that night and into the early morning, he and Bush exchanged Snapchat messages. Normal conversation between friends. But at some point during those hours, Dylan Thomas opened his phone and began searching. Anatomy of neck, veins, arteries, assisted suicide. Christmas Eve morning. Thomas begged his grandmother to drive him home. He told her he needed to walk the dog, Bruce. She agreed. Drove him to Ty Matthew, waited in the car outside. Thomas went inside. He armed himself with 2 knives, a kitchen knife and a flick knife. He walked to Will Bush's bedroom. What happened next lasted 7 minutes. A neighbor heard what they described as screams of horror. Dylan Thomas stabbed William Bush 37 times. 21 of those wounds were to the neck. The prosecution described Bush's neck as shredded. Additional wounds to the chest, the head, the back, 2 knives, 7 minutes, and a young man who had barricaded his window, covered in blood. An ambulance was covered in blood. An ambulance was called. A neighbor called police. Will Bush was 23 years old. He was about to move in with his girlfriend. He had a large circle of friends, a close family, and a career ahead of him. And he died in his bedroom, in the house he shared with his best friend, on Christmas Eve morning. Thomas was charged on December 27th. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter on grounds of diminished responsibility, but not guilty to murder. His defense relied heavily on psychiatric evidence and claims about his mental state. The prosecution, led by Gregory Bull, KC, dismantled that defense with the internet searches, the anatomy queries, the deliberate arming with 2 knives, the calm request to his grandmother for a ride home, the coherent Snapchat messages the night before. This was not a man in the grip of a psychotic break. This was a man who researched where to cut, armed himself, and attacked from behind. On November 20th, 2024, at Cardiff Crown Court, the jury rejected diminished responsibility and found Dylan Thomas guilty of murder. He appeared via video link from Ashworth High Secure Hospital. On January 24th, 2025, Mrs. Justice Stein sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 19 years, adjusted to 17 years and 337 days, accounting for time already served on remand. He won't be eligible for parole consideration until 2042 at the earliest. The impact statements from Bush's family were devastating. His sister Katrin called it a barbaric crime and said she was truly haunted by the horror. His father John said, "This is not normal grief. We are always pretending, haunted daily." His girlfriend Ella Jeffries spoke about the life they were building together, a life that ended with a knock that never came on Christmas morning. The Bush family's final statement cut to the bone. "We have seen no evidence of any remorse or taking responsibility." The process focused heavily on Dylan Thomas and his mental state, which has been incredibly difficult when he is the person who planned and murdered our beloved Will. The judge called Will Bush a compassionate, loving, witty, and vibrant young man who was senselessly murdered, and added, "No sentence could make up for the loss." Dylan Thomas inherited a fortune worth hundreds of millions. He had every advantage the world could offer. And on Christmas Eve morning, he used 2 kitchen knives to take the only real friend he ever had. After the murder, Thomas's behavior grew even more erratic. In November 2024, he attempted to scale a 14-foot fence at Buckingham Palace. He told police he was looking for energy fields between the palace and Cleopatra's Needle. He wrote letters to Elon Musk. When officers detained him, he said, "I'm over now, so you may as well show me round." He is 24 years old. He will be in his 40s before he's even considered for release. And Will Bush, the young man who once barricaded his door because his best friend said he wondered what it would be like to kill him, will never come home. 10 people who had more money than most of us will ever see. And every single one of them decided it still wasn't enough to keep them from destroying someone else's life. Wealth doesn't fix what's broken inside a person. It just gives them more ways to hide it. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.